Back in 2013, I was lying on my bed in an apartment in a small city in Italy when I somehow found out about Unity and that
coding your own games is easier than you think. You know?
Yes, I made this joke in 2020, but it was true, and I was amazed at how accessible game development was becoming to the average person. So I quickly began learning as much as I could, and it wasn't long until I had started making prototypes and small half-finished games. Although I was technically still in university studying industrial design, I think I already knew that I wanted to become a game developer the moment I launched the engine and first saw that black and white Unity logo appear on my screen. At the time, I was also interested in animation, so much so that I tried to get an internship at an animation studio in Italy just a few weeks before, only to have my dream shattered by rejection. Before that, I had practically spent the entirety of my teenage years involved in a variety of online game communities. Modding, scripting, map making, and even posting on forums with my own games and animations that I had made in Flash for fun.
Jesus, I wonder what went through your head when you made this game. At its best you would receive a few lol posts. Hours of work, hours. I don't get you.
Who's laughing now?
So once game development came knocking on my door, it all felt very natural. Like any other sane aspiring game developer, I decided my first game would be an RPG, but I would be making it for mobile since that industry was still in its early days and players didn't yet have any expectations for games on the platform. The first iteration of the character I created for this game might have been a good indication that the animation studio I mentioned before did the right thing in not offering me an internship. Although in my defense, I spent little time on the animations as I was eager to get started with the gameplay. I actually spent quite a few months on this project and I ended up finishing almost all the assets for the first level. I have always enjoyed the Viking Age as a setting in media, but more importantly, I wanted this game to tell a mundane and more narrowly focused story based around fewer factions and characters, as opposed to the typical epic save-the-world story seen in many big Western RPGs at the time. But I eventually realized an RPG probably wasn't the best choice for a first game, so sticking with the Viking theme, I made a top-down, same-screen multiplayer fighting game where you swiped to initiate an attack just like in games such as Mount & Blade, which I was playing a lot at the time, and I thought that the controls would be even better suited to swipes as opposed to mouse movement. However, for reasons I can't remember, I soon abandoned the project and unfortunately it doesn't run anymore on the latest Unity versions, but judging from the animation file, it at least seems like my skills were improving, if only ever so slightly. Being a bit fatigued with medieval games, I decided my next project would be a basketball game. This new game featured perfectly mirrored face textures, inflatable looking characters and overexposed foreheads where apparently the only missing thing was mandatory leg days. Whereas with my RPG there were bugs and features that were far from finished, this game was actually more or less done, and honestly I have no idea how I made it. I'm scared simply playing it because it feels like every time I touch the screen I might set the whole project on fire. Ultimately though, I decided against releasing it because I thought that it was just too ugly, which is ironic considering what was about to come next. At this point, I decided to try out pixel art because creating 3D assets had become too much of a time sink and I wanted to improve my game making skills faster. So I made a little game inspired by the stratosphere jump that happened roughly a year prior, just not as violently. But I didn't release that game either and I was starting to get impatient. So I thought to myself, what if I take an existing game idea and just change it up a bit? At least I will be able to finish it. And sure enough, I released my first game, Hockey Hysteria, in the end of September 2014. I had finally managed to make it through the whole process of creating a game, and by the end of November, just 2 months later, I released Helicopter Hostility. Yeah, I know, my naming convention wasn't most creative, and it was only just the beginning of me releasing games with bad names, because next up was Bouncy Basketball. Released in April of 2015, it quickly gained in popularity, much thanks to the organic growth fueled by the exorbitant amount of time a group of high school students spent in the game during class, during breaks, organizing tournaments, and even going as far as inventing their own currency when their principal banned them from betting.
Now, this is epic.
Now, 5 years after its release, Bouncy Basketball has been downloaded over 9 million times and is my most successful game to this date. I was able to quit my job and work full-time as a game developer. A dream come true. in theory. And in reality too, let's be honest here, but I was struggling creatively. I started making a 2D shooting game with some kind of Victorian era vampire hunting theme, but I quickly lost motivation and drifted off into creating 3D art once again. Feeling confident that I would now be able to handle a third dimension, I set my sights on making an MMA game, since at the time it was one of the only sports that I actually enjoyed watching. When I eventually abandoned the project, however, my prototypes became increasingly more simplistic in controls and in gameplay mechanics. On top of that, my art was regressing back to 2D as well, and all of a sudden I was making games I had no interest in playing myself, and I was stuck replicating an industry dominated by the hyper-casual genre. My mind had been poisoned by the idea of now being a professional mobile game developer. No longer was I just a guy with a laptop making whatever games he felt like making. This all culminated in a game called Jumpy Canyon, and we don't talk about Jumpy Canyon.
This one time I let you ask me about Jumpy Canyon.
It was released in June of 2017, and it's a terrible game. There you have it. To its credit though, I think it looks decent, albeit a bit childish, and it was the first time I had put 2D characters on a 3D background. This gave the game a look that, despite everything, I was very proud of, and mixing 2D and 3D was something that I would repeat in the months to come. Following the release of Jumpy Canyon, I started working on a game titled Sky Apers. Finally, I thought to myself, I had mastered the art of naming my games. The player model was a huge King Kong-like ape, but after watching an episode of Seinfeld where George is jumping up and down like some kind of monkey, I had the idea of having giant human characters in the game as well. But as the numbers from Jumpy Canyon's release started coming in, I knew my next game had to be something far removed from the hyper-casual genre, if for nothing else than for my own sanity. I thought of making a little platformer fighting game, but then I remembered one of the many prototypes I had made prior to Jumpy Canyon. This game was also supposed to have been a platformer, telling the story that I had originally written for my very first game seen at the beginning of this video. Sometime during the development, I had decided that the only good thing about it was the fighting, and so I had turned it into a gladiator game. I decided this was a good enough idea for my next game, with the only exception that I make the characters 2D instead and use the same physics as in Bouncy Basketball. And so Gladihoppers was born. At this time, I also started posting devlogs here on YouTube, and my first video was an announcement of the game. 1 year and a handful of devlogs later, I released Gladihoppers in December of 2018 to a mostly lukewarm reception, but after spending another 6 months on an update that added a career mode, the game took off and has now, 2 years after its release, been downloaded over 2 million times. This was also the first game I released on itch.io for PC and later on for web on Poki.com, along with Bouncy Basketball. Of course, having spent more than a year and a half on Gladihoppers, there were a few side projects that I had started working on over the course of its development. One of which was another casual game, because apparently I hadn't learned a thing from the past. What I did learn though was that having someone else work with me, in this case my girlfriend doing the art, sped up development by a lot. I had hired musicians before, Joshua Taipale for Jumpy Canyon and Red Forge, a duo from Spain that were working on the soundtrack for Gladihoppers, but other than the music, I had always done everything by myself. While nothing ever came of this project though, it did teach me this obvious yet important lesson about collaborating with others, and I soon made another attempt at making a small game. This time it was a clone of an old game of mine, but with wizards replacing the helicopters. The art this time around was created by a guy called Magic Bird, with Red Forge making a return for the music. But as the Gladihoppers career mode update was nearing its release, I had to put this game to sleep. I had to stop working. I'm just trying really hard right now to think of new ways to say that I abandoned the project. Anyway, it was now late 2019 and I began working on a sequel to Bouncy Basketball, which as of this video is still in development. But coming off one big project to start working on another wasn't something that I was ready for just yet, and so I made the decision to spend some months creating a few small games that I would actually try to finish this time around. I would also dedicate more time to YouTube and increase the effort put into my videos. So during the first half of 2020, I created Boomer Simulator, which released in June, and where for the first time I made the music myself, as well as making an attempt at voice acting. However, for my next project, Soccer is Football, which released a month earlier in May, my girlfriend and Red Forge once again made the art and music respectively. Feeling invigorated by having seen 2 projects through to completion, I returned to Bouncy Basketball 2, and right now I'm also working on a multiplayer mode for Gladihoppers. It's been 7 years since I discovered Unity and threw myself headfirst into game development. And while I personally would say the market is much more competitive nowadays compared to when I started, I still feel very optimistic about my future in the industry. If you're a game developer, I hope you do too. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.